Good evening, and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. Tonight, we share another true journey from our Lives series. Stories that explore the human experience, fate, and the mysterious hand of the divine. In today's Lives story, we follow a man who had it all: luxury, success, and applause, but couldn't escape the weight of something missing inside him. But what if the very thing he never believed in was the only thing that could save him? He owned penthouses, cars, companies, even influence. But one day, he looked around and felt nothing. What kind of emptiness haunts a man who has everything? In the fall of 2006, Boston was glowing with golden leaves and sharp winds. It was that time of year when the city shimmered like a painting. But inside the towering glass apartment on Commonwealth Avenue, one man stood behind floor-to-ceiling windows, untouched by the beauty outside. His name was Clint, 47 years old, net worth well into the 8 figures, and the CEO of a successful private equity firm he'd built from scratch. He lived on the 38th floor, where sunlight poured in but failed to warm the space. Everything was minimalist, high-end, and sterile. The silence in his penthouse was the kind that echoed. Clint had grown up poor in Springfield, Massachusetts. The son of a mechanic and a waitress, life had taught him that only power and money could guarantee freedom. And for 2 decades, that philosophy had driven him forward like a machine. He didn't marry, didn't have kids, friends, mostly transactional. He donated to charity, attended galas, spoke at financial conferences, and yet, at night, he sat alone with a glass of $500 scotch, feeling used. Every relationship felt conditional. If he stopped giving, would anyone still show up? He tried therapy. It felt fake. He tried meditation. It made him anxious. So, one night, he typed something into Google he never imagined he would. What is the purpose of life? He chuckled at himself for even asking. But that night, he didn't sleep. The next morning, Clint skipped the gym, turned off CNBC, and began reading forums and articles, philosophy, psychology, then theology. He wasn't raised religious. His parents never took him to church. The idea of God always sounded like a safety net for the weak. But the more he read, the more he encountered something surprising. Not just blind faith, but patterns. He learned that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam weren't as separate as he once thought. The stories overlapped, the figures connected. Abraham, Moses, Mary, Jesus, even Adam. Names he once dismissed as myths suddenly formed a cohesive arc through history. He wasn't looking for God, but he started finding him. 2 weeks later, Clint attended a lecture at Harvard Divinity School, a public discussion on the shared moral foundations of Abrahamic religions. He sat quietly in the back, anonymous in his black coat and expensive watch. A Muslim professor from Detroit spoke about the Quran's recognition of the Torah and Gospel. A Christian scholar nodded as she read passages from the Psalms and Surah Maryam. Clint sat still, focused, curious. It wasn't the religion that struck him. It was the unity, the acknowledgement that these were not competing stories, but chapters in a longer book. When the event ended, Clint walked home, slowly in the cold, hands in his pockets, heartbeat unsure. He didn't know where this road would take him, but for the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, a spark. Clint didn't tell anyone about the lecture. Not his assistant, not his business partners, not even his driver. It was his secret, one he kept tucked behind the iron wall of his public life. By day, he was still the Clint everyone knew, calculating, confident, and always one step ahead. But at night, something in him had changed. He stopped watching financial news. He stopped drinking before bed. Instead, he began to read, first the Torah, then parts of the New Testament, eventually the Quran. He wasn't sure what he believed yet, but the similarities between the three scriptures fascinated him. They didn't sound like fairy tales. They spoke of justice, mercy, discipline, and love. They warned about greed and arrogance. They lifted up the poor, and in their center stood a creator, not just a god of thunder or ritual, but one who was near, one who spoke. At night, Clint sat by the window with his books and a yellow legal pad. He filled pages with notes and questions. Why do all three religions talk about fasting? Why is there so much overlap between commandments? What does it mean to surrender? He found comfort in the ritual of learning. He'd been a student of the market for decades. Now, he was a student of something deeper. One Sunday morning in late November, Clint did something he never thought he'd do. He walked into a mosque. It wasn't planned. He'd read online that the Islamic Center of Boston in Wayland offered a beginner-friendly class on world religions. He sat in the back again, anonymous in his pea coat. The imam spoke gently, not to convert, but to explain. He used words like continuity, compassion, and choice. He referenced Jesus with reverence. He answered questions with patience. No one asked Clint who he was. No one judged. After class, a teenage boy held the door for him and smiled. That smile stayed with Clint the entire drive home. That winter, something remarkable happened. The pressure in Clint's chest, the one he used to quiet with money, travel, or whiskey, started to lift. He began to pray. Not formally at first, just quiet conversations in the dark. Words like, "If you're there, I need to know. I don't want to feel this way forever. Please, show me what matters." And somewhere in those private moments, peace began to leak into his soul. He'd wake up before dawn and sit in stillness. He turned off his phone. He wrote down blessings, warm socks, clean sheets, the sound of wind, the kindness of strangers. For the first time since he was a child, he felt grateful. But fate wasn't done with Clint yet, because in the background, unnoticed by most, a storm was brewing. The real test of his faith, of his transformation, was closer than he knew. The year was 2007. The markets were beginning to crack, and Clint's firm was over-leveraged. It started with a phone call. Bear Stearns just froze 2 of their funds, said Jeremy, Clint's portfolio manager, his voice tight over the speakerphone. Clint didn't panic. He'd lived through market tremors before. He told Jeremy to reduce exposure, tighten positions, and prepare for volatility. But in truth, a chill ran down his spine. Over the next few months, the headlines turned darker. Subprime defaults, layoffs, foreclosures, CEOs on television with forced smiles. Clint knew what was coming, and this time, he wasn't untouchable. His firm, Kingsdale Capital, had made bold bets, and some of those bets were starting to rot. His condo investments in Florida were hemorrhaging. His commercial loans in Phoenix were going unpaid. He was losing control. One morning in March 2008, he walked into the office early. The building was quiet. He went into his corner office and stared at the skyline, his kingdom. He whispered aloud, "So, is this the test?" Not long ago, that question would have sounded ridiculous to him. But now, it felt real, like someone was listening. By summer, the walls were caving in. One of his largest partners pulled out of a $50 million deal. Another filed for bankruptcy. The calls from angry investors started piling up. Lawsuits, media whispers, even his accountant suggested moving assets offshore. Clint didn't. He paid every employee their full severance. He sold his Boston penthouse and moved into a small home in Brookline. He shut down Kingsdale Capital with dignity. When asked by a former colleague why he didn't try to fight it or flee, Clint just smiled gently. "Because this isn't everything," he said. "Not anymore." His friends didn't understand. "You need to bounce back," said Evan, an old business school buddy. "Start a new fund. You still have the connections, the talent." Clint just shook his head. "I need to breathe," he replied. "Really breathe. For once." At night, he still prayed. But now, the words were different. "Thank you for the fall. Thank you for stripping away the noise. I finally see what matters." In October 2008, while the world was screaming and the Dow was collapsing, Clint volunteered at a shelter on Tremont Street. He served soup, swept floors, helped fold blankets. A man named Leonard, gray-haired, in tattered boots, looked at Clint's clean face and asked, "You a student?" Clint laughed. "Something like that." That night, walking home in the cold, Clint wept. Not because he had lost everything, but because he had finally found something. Clint never returned to the old world. The suits, the conferences, the rush, they belonged to another lifetime. Now, his days were quieter, simpler. He woke up before dawn, brewed a single cup of coffee, and read. Not business journals or earnings reports, but the Psalms, the Quran, the Gospel of Matthew. He didn't need to choose one religion, not yet. He was still listening, still learning. The texts spoke of patience, mercy, accountability. They spoke of hearts hardening when wealth became a god. They described exactly the man Clint used to be. One passage from the Quran struck him hard. Indeed, mankind transgresses when he sees himself self-sufficient. Quran 96:6-7. He wrote it down and pinned it to his fridge. One afternoon in early 2009, Clint sat on a park bench near Boston Common. A young woman beside him was reading a small Bible. After a few quiet minutes, he asked gently, "What brings you peace?" She looked up and smiled. "Knowing that I don't have to carry the world alone." Clint smiled back. They talked for half an hour. Her name was Aubrey. She worked at a children's hospital and sang in a small church choir on Sundays. Before leaving, she said, "God doesn't need perfection. He just needs permission." Those words stayed with him. As the months passed, Clint began to open up. Not to the public, but to life. He visited churches and mosques, listened to podcasts on faith, and spent time walking through cemeteries, reflecting on how temporary life really was. He made amends. Quietly, he apologized to an old mentor he'd once disrespected in a board meeting. He mailed a handwritten letter to his estranged brother in San Diego. The brother he hadn't spoken to in 11 years after a bitter inheritance argument. He forgave a woman who'd betrayed him in a business deal, not by calling her, but by letting go of the bitterness. Every act felt like loosening a knot inside his chest. By early 2010, Clint had less money in his account than he'd had since he was 30. But he was happier than ever. He volunteered. He meditated. He prayed 5 times a day. Not always perfectly, and not always the same way, but always sincerely. He was no longer angry, no longer afraid. He had traded the currency of Wall Street for something quieter, stronger, purpose. But life wasn't done writing his story. Not yet. Because one final chapter, the most unexpected, was still on its way. It was a Wednesday morning in the spring of 2011 when Clint received a letter in the mail. No return address. Handwritten. Thick cream paper. Inside was a simple note. "Your brother has late-stage cancer. He doesn't have long. He's asking for you." The world seemed to pause. Clint hadn't seen Derek since their father's funeral 12 years ago. Their last words were venom. They had parted not just as brothers, but as enemies. Clint sat for a long while, the letter trembling in his hands. Then, without overthinking it, he packed a bag and booked a flight to San Diego. Derek was in hospice. Clint walked into the room slowly, unsure of what he'd find. Derek looked thinner, older, weaker, but his eyes lit up when he saw his brother. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Derek whispered, "I didn't want to leave without saying I'm sorry." Clint swallowed hard. "I'm the one who should have said that first," he replied, his voice breaking. They spoke for hours, about childhood, about regrets, about life, about death. Derek asked him why he looked different. Clint smiled. "Because I finally found what I was looking for, and it wasn't in money." Clint stayed with Derek for 3 weeks. He helped bathe him, held his hand during pain spikes, read scripture to him from all three holy books. Derek cried often. So did Clint. One night, Derek asked, "Do you think there's really something after this?" Clint paused, then answered honestly, "I do. I don't know every detail, but I know there's a mercy bigger than anything we've ever imagined." Derek died peacefully 2 days later. Clint was the only family by his side. At the funeral, Clint stood in the back, silent. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to be seen. Later that night, he walked alone on the beach, barefoot in the sand, listening to the waves. He whispered a prayer under the stars, not asking for anything, not thanking for anything, just being. "You never left me," he said aloud, "even when I never looked for you." A cool breeze brushed past his face, and he smiled. He wasn't wealthy anymore. He wasn't powerful. But in that moment, he was the richest man he'd ever been. And for the first time in his life, Clint felt truly free. Clint returned to Boston with a lighter heart. He had no firm to run, no empire to guard, but what he had now was worth far more. A kind of peace that didn't depend on how the market opened. He moved into a modest apartment in Cambridge, just 2 blocks from a local community center. Each week, he led a small interfaith discussion group there. Jews, Christians, Muslims, even agnostics came together, not to debate, but to understand. They read from their books. They shared stories. They cried together sometimes. Clint never called himself a preacher. He didn't claim to have all the answers. He called himself a seeker, someone who finally stopped running from the questions that mattered. He told the group, "I spent 25 years believing life was a ladder, always climbing, always grasping, but I realized some ladders are leaning against the wrong wall." One evening after a group session, a young man named Malik approached Clint. He was 21, a business student at MIT. "I read your story online," Malik said. "I didn't know who you were before tonight, but I want what you found." Clint put a hand on his shoulder. "You already have it," he said. "It's not buried, it's just quiet." In the years that followed, Clint lived simply. He did odd consulting gigs to pay the bills, but mostly he taught. Not finance, but ethics, humility, gratitude, purpose. He no longer measured success in digits. He measured it in mornings, without anxiety, in quiet walks, in meals with the lonely, in letters from people who told him, "Your words gave me hope." One winter, Clint visited an elderly man in hospice. A stranger someone from the community center asked him to sit with. The man was scared, angry, alone. Clint didn't quote scripture. He didn't recite prayers. He just held the man's hand and whispered, "You are seen, you are loved, and you are forgiven." The man wept and held on tight. Clint had no idea if that man ever believed in God, but that night, Clint felt something sacred pass between them, something real. And that's when he realized he didn't need his name in lights. He didn't need a mansion in the sky. He just needed to live each day in truth. By 2015, Clint had become a quiet figure in Boston's spiritual circles. He was never the loudest in the room, never the one to quote the most verses. But he listened deeply. He remembered names. He made people feel like they mattered, whether they were professors or janitors, priests or skeptics. On most mornings, you could find him sitting on the same bench at Jamaica Pond, feeding birds and sipping coffee from a paper cup. He'd smile at joggers. He'd nod at the old men with chessboards. And once in a while, someone would sit beside him and start to talk. He never pushed religion. He simply shared his journey. If they asked, "I thought wealth would give me safety," he once told a struggling man, "but safety only came when I accepted I wasn't in control." That same year, Clint received a visit from an old colleague, one who had once envied him, even resented him. The man's name was Stephen. He was now struggling with addiction. His second marriage had failed, and he was clinging to the last threads of his career. He came to Clint not for advice, but for a place to rest. Clint let him stay in his spare room. He cooked him warm meals. He took him to group meetings. And each night, they sat by the window and talked about what it meant to start over. One night, Stephen asked, "How are you not bitter? You lost more than I did." Clint looked at him with soft eyes. "Because I gained what matters most." In 2017, Clint traveled for the first time in years, not for business, but for pilgrimage. He visited Jerusalem. He walked the cobbled streets of the old city. He prayed at the Western Wall. He stood before the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He sat in quiet awe at the Al-Aqsa compound as the sun set over the Dome of the Rock. Three faiths, one God. He didn't need a label anymore. He had found the thread that connected it all. And that thread had changed everything. He wrote in his journal that night, "I used to ask, why me? Now I ask, what for?" And in that shift, I found peace. By 2020, Clint had quietly become a mentor to dozens of people, none of them from his old world. Single mothers trying to make sense of faith, refugees learning English and scripture in the same breath, teens wrestling with depression, former inmates trying to believe they deserved a second chance. Clint didn't preach to them. He walked with them. He opened a tiny second-hand bookstore in Cambridge called The Turning Point. It smelled of old paper and cinnamon tea. In the back, there was a circle of worn-out chairs where people came every Thursday night just to talk about pain, about love, about forgiveness. There was no donation box, no logo, no agenda, just space and truth. When the pandemic hit in 2020, Clint kept the doors open as long as he could, masked, distanced, and cautious. He started delivering books to homes and hospitals. He recorded readings and emailed them to patients dying alone. He'd end each audio with the same words, "You are seen. You are loved. You are never alone." People began forwarding those recordings to their friends, their families, their colleagues. Soon, strangers were writing to Clint from Ohio, Arizona, even Canada. They didn't know about his past. They only knew his voice made them feel safe. On his 65th birthday in 2024, Clint sat alone in his small garden behind the bookstore. He wasn't surrounded by luxury. He didn't wear a watch worth thousands. There was no applause, no boardroom, no headlines. Just him, a candle, and a small note someone had slipped under the door. "Thank you for teaching me how to breathe again." That night, he wrote one final entry in his journal. "When I had everything, I was starving. When I lost it all, I was saved. Not by luck, not by accident, but by grace." Conclusion. Clint's story reminds us that wealth is not always abundance, and poverty is not always loss. Sometimes, losing the world is the only way to find your soul. Sometimes, faith doesn't arrive with lightning. It whispers through cracks in your certainty. Tonight, let's remember that self-worth isn't bought. That meaning doesn't come from power, but from purpose. That grace often hides in endings. Thank you for being part of our Fireside Circle tonight. If the story touched your heart, share it to the ones you love. And if you would like to listen to more like it, you know where to find us.